intermission, Lubochka Schuster found herself in front of the wrong door and thus unwittingly ruined her childhood. She was looking for the restroom and wandered into a dark corridor by mistake. There was a door sign with a lady's head on it. Lubochka pushed it slightly ajar and froze. The room was full of flowers. Huge bouquets of roses multiplied in the mirrors on the walls, and Lubochka felt she had stumbled upon the Garden of Eden. In the middle of the room, there was a handsome mustached man down on one knee. He was passionately kissing the hand of the pianist who had just performed on the stage. "Leonid, that's enough," she said, laughing. "Get up and go to the auditorium. I need to go on stage now." "You are a sorceress," he kept saying. "Today you have everyone under your spell." Back home, Lubochka announced that she wanted to be a pianist. Her father was delighted. He had always hoped that Lubochka would go far. And soon, 4 strong fellows brought a grand piano into the living room of the Schuster's house. It was soon followed by a music teacher, who was also a governess and an enforcer of etiquette. She was a small, plump French woman by the name of Mademoiselle Emma. "To achieve mastery, you have to play the piano every day," she told Lubochka and put a big stack of sheet music in front of her. Lubochka realized that she was trapped. Once Mademoiselle Emma was committed to the cause, there was no stopping her. She really enjoyed living at the Schusters, and she knew that if her efforts did not succeed, she would have to find herself a new job and a new home. At times, Lubochka was so angry with Mademoiselle Emma that she stomped her feet at her teacher. "If you make me practice anymore, I'll tell Mother that you have a pet mouse living under your bed and that you refuse to get rid of it." Mademoiselle Emma raised an arched eyebrow. "So you're declaring war on Sebastian and me?" Sebastian was the name of the mouse who ate out of Mademoiselle Emma's hand and slept in her knitting basket. "Well, so be it," she said, and imposed an immediate embargo on all cookies, curfews after 8 p.m., and even stricter cordon sanitaire for all members of the household under the age of 16. However, this edict did not apply to Sebastian, who had been granted diplomatic immunity. "I guess you also have to play scales during your Christmas break," Mademoiselle Emma said nonchalantly, adding the last and most persuasive argument. "Instead of going to the theater with your cousin." She knew that she'd got her student there, and Lubochka dragged herself to the music room to bang at the keys and curse her big mouth. The Rogoffs, Lubochka's uncle and his son Clim, came to Moscow every year before Christmas. They were rich and the beneficiaries of an ancient and noble title. Lubochka had to address her uncle in the most respectful way, always adding his patronymic to his first name, Alexander Ilyich. Her uncle was the provincial prosecutor in Nizhny Novgorod, a man of such stature that even Lubochka's father, who was himself a highly respected figure, could not help but feel a little intimidated in his presence. Lubochka's father was a well-known critic, and Moscow's finest authors and actors were in awe of him because he was capable of writing reviews that could make or break any career. To impress the Rogoffs, Lubochka's mother always hired extra servants and an expensive cook. She brought out her favorite embroidered tablecloths from the chest and ordered brighter light bulbs for the electric lamps, while Lubochka's father personally polished the silverware that he had bought from an impoverished count. The letter S was engraved on the forks and spoons, and he told everybody that it was his own monogram. Lubochka cared very little for the persecutor. He was always talking about appeals and the governing Senate, and listening to him was even more boring than listening to Mademoiselle Emma. But Clim was a source of both joy and misery for Lubochka. He was superior to her in every way. He had numerous friends, from stage workers to riverboat pilots. He had read Anna Karenina and Vanity Fair, books that Lubochka was not even allowed to hold in her hands for fear that their dubious subject matter would contaminate her morals. Clim could explore ancient ruins, talk to gypsy fortune-tellers, or ride the top of a double-decker, while Lubochka was not allowed to do anything. Her parents loved her so much that they did not let her go anywhere without her governess. And how was it even possible to bring Mademoiselle Emma to any ancient ruins with her shortness of breath? Lubochka was on her way home from school when she noticed an unfamiliar lacquered sled covered with a carpet by her house. Her heart in her throat, she ran up to the front door and went inside without even bothering to brush off the snow from her felt boots. The Rogoffs were already here, but they were meant to be arriving in Moscow for another 3 days' time. Lubochka could not find her slippers, and still in her thick wool stockings she ran toward the sound of voices coming from the living room. She froze in front of the door and peeped inside. Alexander Ilyich was sitting on the couch in front of the fireplace, bald-headed, long-necked and hook-nosed, like a vulture. He smoked a weird meerschaum pipe with a bowl that was carved in the shape of his wife's head. Auntie had died a few years ago, and Lubochka always found it slightly distasteful, if not disrespectful, to stuff the head of a loved one with tobacco and then smoke it. But none of Alexander Ilyitch's relatives dared mention it openly. One day, Lubochka overheard the servants whispering in the kitchen. They said that Alexander Ilyitch's wife had cheated on him, gotten pregnant, and died from botched abortion. Lubochka didn't know what an abortion was, but she instinctively understood it was not something you asked your parents about. A delivery boy she knew filled her in, and the truth was so horrifying, Lubochka refused to believe it. She remembered her aunt as young, beautiful, and full of life. An abortion? What nonsense! And yet, she felt that this strange story had left a mark on the Rogoff family. Excited, Lubochka looked around in the living room. Where was Clim? Then she saw him coming in through the opposite door. He had grown from the boy she remembered into a broad-shouldered young man. He now wore his dark hair parted at the side and looked impeccable in his grey pinstripe trousers and morning coat with a white handkerchief in the breast pocket. "We went straight to the university from the station," Alexander Ilyich said, pointing at his son with the end of his pipe. "It's time to put this young man to work. Next year, he will finish school, and I have already told him that there won't be any parties or theaters. He will need to get ready for his entrance exams." "What field have you chosen?" asked Lubochka's father, turning to Clim. "If he's smart enough, he'll follow in my footsteps and also become a lion of Moscow University's law department," Alexander Ilyich answered. "A prudent choice," said Lubochka's mother, and she rose. "I'll go and see to the arrangements for dinner." Lubochka rushed to her room before her mother noticed her and made her greet the guests in her stupid school uniform that made her look more like 12 than her true 15 years of age. Mademoiselle Emma also burst into Lubochka's room. "Your cousin is here!" she whispered excitedly. I know, Lubochka moaned and collapsed on the stool in front of the dressing table. "Where's my curling iron?" There was a big ink stain on her elbow that refused to be scrubbed off, so she had to find a dress with long sleeves. The curling iron became overheated, and Mademoiselle Emma almost burned Lubochka's bang. Her shoes were too tight, although they had only been bought 6 months ago. Mademoiselle Emma became so anxious that she had to take her medicine for her nerves. "You must play the piano for Clim," she kept saying. "Young men enjoy it when ladies play for them." Lubochka could barely restrain herself from barking back. "How on earth would you know?" She was sure Mademoiselle Emma had never had a male admirer apart from Sebastian. The bell rang, announcing dinner. Mademoiselle Emma went to her room and came back with a bottle of French cologne, one of her most prized possessions. "Let me spray you a little," she said, and squeezed the rubber ball of the atomizer. A scented cloud blanketed Lubochka's head. "Now you smell like a rose," said Mademoiselle Emma. Lubochka looked at her reflection in the mirror. She had frizzy, almost platinum white hair that made her look like a dandelion cloak. And indeed, that's what Clim had called her when they were little children. Mademoiselle Emma's etiquette lessons had not been lost on her student. Lubochka managed to greet the guests politely, answered their questions about her school, and didn't betray her excitement when Clim gave her his arm and accompanied her to the dinner table. But after the prayer, Lubochka realized that she could not swallow a piece of food. She felt that she wanted to hide from everyone in the safety of her room, and at the same time she wanted to throw herself on Clim and say, "I'm so happy you've come." He didn't eat anything either. Lubochka fidgeted, coughing softly in her fist, and then asked Clim to pass her the salt shaker. But he never looked at her, listening carefully to the adults at the other end of the table. Alexander Ilyich told Lubochka's parents about the university curriculum. They nodded and willingly agreed that it's much better to keep students busy with their studies than allow them too much free time to get involved in any nonsense. Lubochka could not stand it any longer. "Do you want to go to the theater tomorrow?" she whispered into Clim's ear, and even dared to touch his hand. "There's Wolfram Weed in the Moscow Art Theater." "I think I have quite enough of Wu in my life as it is," Clim said, not even turning his head. "What's wrong with you today?" Lubochka asked, perplexed. "Has something happened?" "Well," Clim paused, looking at his plate. "When my friends made their career choices, all they thought about was money and position. But that's all wrong. A profession is like a marriage. If you make the wrong choice, it's like a slow, lingering death." Clim glanced at his father, who had taken his pipe out of his pocket and started to stuff his wife's head with tobacco. "I thought you've already chosen your profession," Lubochka began, but Clim interrupted her. "As if anyone asked me. My father doesn't care about my vocation." "How do you know what your vocation is?" "I just know that I can influence the people around me, but I'd rather inspire than denounce them." Lubochka nodded. Indeed, Clim could captivate anyone. She suddenly remembered the beautiful pianist and the words of her admirer. "You are a sorceress. Today, you've got everybody under your spell." "I think I have a vocation for music," Lubochka told Clim. She also wanted to influence the people. As soon as they were allowed to leave the table, Lubochka took Clim to the music room. It was already getting dark, and it had started to snow. The lamp under the shade, patterned with tiny holes, sprinkled the walls with golden stars. "Do you want me to play Moonlight Sonata?" asked Lubochka as she sat on the spinning stool in front of the grand piano. Clim nodded. "Yes, please." His face was reflected in the piano lid, and she covered it with sheet music. It was impossible to play with those piercing brown eyes in front of her. "I will not make a single mistake," Lubochka promised herself and struck the keys. She was familiar with the tune, and the only thing she had to do was make sure that her fingers wouldn't accidentally hit a wrong note. Everything went as perfectly as it had at the school concert. When the last chord died away, her parents in the next room clapped. They always did this to encourage their daughter and to show her that they care about her musical efforts. "Bravo!" Mademoiselle Emma cried. Blushing with excitement and pride, Lubochka gave Clim a triumphant glance. "Can you do something like that?" "I could try." He sat at the piano, and she stood beside him, her elbows resting on the piano lid. Clim played the Moonlight Sonata as well, but as he played, the adults, including servants, tiptoed from the neighboring rooms and stood crowded around the piano. Never before had Lubochka seen her mother enjoying music with such a rapt expression. Mademoiselle Emma leaned forward and squeezed her hands under her chin, and Lubochka's father just moved his lips silently. Wow! Even Alexander Ilyich came, and he was the sort of man who would only go to the theater to discuss business in his private box. He stood in the doorway, tilting his head like a big old bird. Wonderful, unforgettable sounds filled the air, and Lubochka suddenly felt that she was just an imposter, a dandelion pretending to be a beautiful rose. Her parents, servants, and Mademoiselle Emma were all playing their part in this dishonest and stupid pretense, but it had taken Clim only a few chords to show her up to everybody in her true colors. When Clim stopped playing, everybody clapped and cried bravo. Lubochka, beside herself, grabbed the sheet music and tore it up. "What are you doing?" her mother gasped. Sobbing with humiliation, Lubochka dashed away to her room and fell on her bed without turning the light on. Lubochka could now see how her life was going to pan out. Everything would be incredibly conventional. A conventional husband and a conventional house. The height of adventure for her would be fussing over new fabric for her chairs in an upholstery shop. No truly talented person would ever find her interesting. How could she continue to live if her life was going to be so bleak and meaningless? Lubochka could hear footsteps coming from behind the door. "She does not want to see you," Mademoiselle Emma protested. The door handle twitched, and a bright light burst into the room from the corridor. "Leave us, please," Clim told Mademoiselle Emma, almost physically pushing her out of the door. The door closed, and the room became dark again. Lubochka was afraid to move. "He's crushing the poor dear girl," Mademoiselle Emma moaned behind the door. "It wasn't gentlemanly of him to show off his superiority like that." Clim sat next to Lubochka and began to stroke her hair. "I won't play the piano ever again," he said after a while. "But why not?" asked Lubochka. She was so astonished that she sat up. "My father doesn't want me to study music. He does not see art as something that should be taken seriously." Clim exhaled deeply. "But if I don't go to the conservatory, I'll achieve nothing, and I'll never be able to..." He got up and walked to the window, silhouetted by the streetlights. "You don't even realize how lucky you are to have a family like yours," he said pensively. "Your parents support you in every way. They know you have talent." "I'll never be like you," Lubochka cried angrily. "Believe me, you wouldn't want to be." "Why not?" "Because you are in charge of your own life. You get to choose what to do and what to reach for. People like me, we are meant to serve God, country, or art. Your calling demands everything you've got. You don't belong to yourself." Try explaining that to my father. He told me if I failed the entrance exams for law school, he'd send me into the army. Said, "You can play the drum in the regimental band." Lubochka couldn't even imagine such a thing. "But he knows you have a great talent. I saw him listening to you play." "He also has talent. You know what he's like when he insists on something. Besides, I'm too much like my mother, and he still hates her. And me too." Clim was obviously desperate, and Lubochka tried in vain to devise a rescue plan. What if she asked her parents to support and shelter Clim? But no, they would never oppose Alexander Ilyich. Clim had nowhere to go. His father, with his connections and influence, would be sure to find him anyway and make his life miserable. "You know what?" said Lubochka. "You should get your law degree and find a job, and later you could study music." Clim shook his head. "There won't be a later. I have to practice every day, or I'll lose even what little I have achieved. In any case, it's too late. Father has ordered that my piano be smashed up and burned in the stove. He always burns things. And he'll make sure that I won't get access to a piano while I'm in Moscow. You can always come over here and practice." There was a soft knock at the door. "Clim, your father is looking for you," Mademoiselle Emma said. He turned to Lubochka. His outline against the window was black and faceless. "I'll think of something," Clim promised and left. Mademoiselle Emma rushed back to Lubochka's room. Did he apologize? Did he realize what a thoughtless and bad thing he had done? She hugged the sobbing Lubochka. "I won't let anyone hurt my precious girl." The next day, Alexander Ilyich took Clim to the dean of the law department, and Lubochka spent the rest of the day in an agony of love and distress. She would approach her piano, play several chords, and immediately close the lid. It was her, not Clim, who should be forgetting about music. When he had played the piano, he had served some mysterious deity, and he was willing to sacrifice everything for it. His future, his career, and even good relationships with his father. Clim realized that ransom that this deity was demanding of him, but there was no alternative for him. He was not the master of his fate. Lubochka couldn't wait to talk to Clim. What would happen to him now? What happens to people who can't follow their destiny? Lubochka wandered into the library and noticed an art book left by Mademoiselle Emma on the desk. There was an image of the Diana of Versailles on the front page. She was pulling an arrow out of her quiver, and Lubochka noticed that the marble huntress had wavy, platinum-white hair, like hers. Clim had mentioned that it's up to her what she does with her life. Actually, she could get goals for herself and pursue them, like she always had. What if this ability was her natural talent? I want Clim to be my goal, Lubochka decided. The Rogoffs didn't return in the evening, though. Alexander Ilyich had been urgently summoned to his office in Nizhny Novgorod, and he had not allowed Clim to stay in Moscow. The cab driver who came for their luggage said that Mr. Rogoff and his son had had a big fight. Lubochka sent Clim several letters, but he never replied. In April, the news came that he had disappeared. His father had looked for him in mortuaries and hospitals and even announced a reward for any information leading to his son's whereabouts, but to no avail. Lubochka waited several weeks for him to come. She made Mademoiselle Emma leave the bedroom window open and spent many nights listening for rustling sounds from the garden. But Clim never showed up. The first postcard from him came several years later. At the time, Lubochka was married and living in Nizhny Novgorod. It transpired that her cousin had left for Persia, then China, and had finally ended up in Argentina, where he had become a famous journalist and frequent visitor to the president's palace. As promised, Clim had stopped playing the piano, mainly because he did not have a piano, but he had found another way to serve his deity. He came back to Russia in 1917, right before the Bolshevik Revolution, without the slightest idea of the consequences this return would have for him and Lubochka. To find out what happens next to Clim, Rogoff and Lubochka, read the novel Russian Treasures.